Welcome to another Coffee in English with me, the Alchemist. Today we have the distinct pleasure of hosting a true luminary in the world of health and fitness, a medical professional whose expertise transcends traditional boundaries. I'm thrilled to introduce you none other than Dr. Doug McGuff. Dr. Doug McGuff is a name synonymous with revolutionary ideas in the fields of exercise physiology, health optimization, and longevity. As a physician, author, and educator, Dr. Doug McGuff has dedicated his life to exploring the science behind strength training, metabolic health, and the profound impact these factors have on our overall quality of life. Get ready to expand your knowledge, challenge preconceptions, and embark on a journey toward a healthier, more vibrant you. As we engage in a thought-provoking conversation with the one and only Dr. Doug McGuff. The coffee is ready. Let's dive in.
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello, hello.
Can you see me? Let's see. Start video.
Miles McGuff. Oh, I see you. Perfect. I know this location. You use that room for most.
Oh yeah, this is a little study with a desktop computer and bring the laptop in here, so I got multiple things going. This is a familiar room for people.
Cool. So thank you for being here and for your time. So first of all, thank you for being here today.
Yes, my pleasure.
We met a little bit more or less 2 years ago in Barcelona for the first time.
Yes.
This was. I also had the opportunity of interviewing Mark Alexander. He's sending you greetings. So.
Awesome.
And so today I want to go through over. So here I have. This I have this is the Q&A book is very hard to find actually, so it's coming straight from the US and of course Body by Science. And the first question I have, the Body by Science is I think 11 years old.
Yep, it is.
Yeah, a lot of time. So in your opinion, what has changed during this 11 years? What if you today you had the opportunity to write a addendum, a second part 2, I don't know. So what kind of stuff you will include?
Okay, so if the question is how would I rewrite the book on its release date back in 2012, I probably would not change anything because it seemed to work out pretty well. If I was to rewrite it or make an addendum for today, there are a few things I would probably change in how the book is structured. One is I wouldn't spend as much time or as much emphasis on demonizing steady state activity or running or things of that nature. That's one thing that I would do. The other thing that I would de-emphasize is just the notion of the big five. I think what came through that book, when people get through reading it, is they think that those 5 exercises are somehow special and that one should never deviate from that for any reason, whether it be equipment availability or just changing a routine over time. People a lot of times get very locked into that as something prescriptive, when the real purpose for doing that is I just wanted to select some big, simple to perform movements from a coordination and complexity standpoint that would cover the whole body. So I would de-emphasize that as a best way of approaching things somewhat. And the other thing that would have to be updated now is to wrap the whole notion of myokines, which are chemical signaling molecules released by exercising muscle, because Body by Science was full of observations about how the benefits of strength training seem to be greater than just getting stronger. And this now offers an underpinning explanation for that observation and why it's true.
Great, cool. Yeah, we will talk a little bit more about the myokines in interleukin 6. Yeah, about the big five. I just have this. I repeated the joke about the big five. You mentioned in one of the interviews with Mark Alexander that you were in Spain and everyone was focused in this big five, like a recipe, a magic one. But again, and you mentioned we're lucky we were not in Germany because they are more strict in their thought. Yeah.
But the funny thing is when I went and spoke in Dresden, and it's just different cultures behave differently and have a different orientation. And I had no idea how popular this was in Germany. And I think it is because the book seems to offer a very kind of regimented, locked-in approach. And they culturally just seem to like that a lot. But it was hard to not just completely knock people that have that sort of orientation. It's difficult to not just completely knock them off the rails when you suggest, oh, you don't really have to do it that way. I was like, what?
Confusion,
yeah.
panic.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mentioned with Mark also the big five are the learning curve. Is there a lot of advantage in using those five? But again, push pull, and legs. So the concept is the basic concept is that one. So we can of course change a routine in order for variety, but the concepts are still the same.
Right.
Yeah, going back to interleukin 6 in particular, because I read recently, I'm a little bit confused because of, so if you want to introduce the myokines in general concept and the importance of interleukin 6 and the effects, because there are apparently there's a controversy, is it positive or negative? So.
Okay, so all these things exist in our body for a reason. So it is context dependent as to whether it is positive or negative. Existing in the right balance with other chemical messengers in the body, it's obviously a good thing. It's one of the major inflammatory cytokines that initiates the innate immune response whenever we encounter an infecting organism, a foreign body like a splinter that's gotten in that needs to be dealt with, or an infection of some sort. Interleukin 6 is one of the inflammatory cytokines that initiates your body's response to this. And it is involved in what's called the innate immune response. So we have two responses to an infection. Initially, we activate an innate immune response, and that's where these chemical messengers come in, mark the site of trouble, and that sends out a chemical message for all sorts of white blood cells, neutrophils, and different other cytokines to attack the invading organism and kill it through a destructive process. That's going on while the second half of the immune system is taking its time to ramp up, and that's adaptive immunity. And that's the part where your body is making a specific antibody to the invading organism that will fit it like lock and key and tag it for destruction. So the first part of your immune response is kind of like D-Day at Normandy. And then the second part of your immune response is more like a laser-guided missile. But you need D-Day at Normandy to have the time to make the laser-guided missile. So interleukin 6 is one of the cytokines that if you don't make a good transition between innate and adaptive immunity, and don't shut down innate immunity as you proceed into adaptive immunity, interleukin 6 is one of the major drivers of cytokine storm. So when that spins out of control, you have uncontrolled inflammation running away like a wildfire. And because of that, interleukin 6 has kind of been pegged as a bad player. It's also, when chronically elevated, a major driver of chronic diseases of inflammation, whether that be arthritis, coronary artery disease, fill in the blank. So it's kind of gotten a bad name as a bad player. Well, interleukin 6 was one of the first cytokines or chemokines that was identified as responding to high intensity exercise. And what we found when you look back on that research is that when you do high intensity exercise, like high intensity weightlifting, you have a huge acute spike in interleukin 6. I mean, going up, hundreds, thousands fold. And the immediate reaction to that was, this can't be good. Because this is a bad player and we're spiking it hugely. But what we found is that those huge spikes create a downregulation of the interleukin 6 receptors that receive that chemical message. So what we trade off for these huge acute spikes is, over a longer span of time, a general lowering of the interleukin 6 levels in our bloodstream and in our system over the more chronic basis. So these acute spikes in this inflammatory cytokine result in a general lowering over time. I think of it in the same way that when you exercise or you do aerobic exercise, you're spiking and elevating your heart rate. But the overall effect over the other 23 hours of the day is that your heart rate comes down.
Yeah.
So it's a similar sort of adaptation to that spike. So that's how that was discovered to be linked to resistance exercise or exercise in general, and kind of opened the whole pathway for this notion that muscles are sending out chemical messengers as well, and they have effects in the same way that cytokines do. But as we delve deeper, what we found is that the chemical messengers released from muscles, cytokines released from muscles, which have been termed myokines, largely have opposing anti-inflammatory properties that help to prevent events like cytokine storm, that help to prevent diseases of chronic inflammation. And it's just a whole basket of benefits that we weren't aware of before on anything other than an intuitive level.
Perfect, really clear. So we need to avoid spikes after spike. What if we overtrain, or is it also caused by overtraining? Is if we spike?
Well, theoretically, yeah. I mean, particularly if you're someone that is in a state of kind of chronic inflammation. And a lot of people do this when they try to get on the bandwagon about exercise. And I think a lot of time what knocks them off is they get inspired and they're really going to hit it. And the whole, Western work ethic of more is better kicks in. And then they overtrain. And if you have so many acute spikes layered on top of chronic systemic inflammation, you can kind of spin the whole thing out of control. And that's where a lot of people, I think, fall off the wagon with too much exercise, or exercise that's too much in volume relative to intensity. I think there is an important balance that has to be struck there.
Yeah, really good. And then not considering that we can stack also the stress during this period, but any period, the stress or other stressors on top of this. And
right.
Recently, Dr. James Steele has mentioned a couple of studies about the recovery and stress. So stress is influencing recovery speed and effectiveness of recovery after workout, after any physical activity. So this is something to be taken into account for sure. Let's go. One of the best concepts I really liked it because it's clear and is very nice. Is the aging curve, the physiological headroom concept. Mm-hmm. If you want briefly just to define the physiological headroom, and then if you, in your experience during these years of training and ultimate exercise, you have what have you found in relation to that?
Yeah, so the concept of physiologic headroom was actually first discussed by Arthur Devaney, who's sort of the grandfather of the kind of the Paleolithic or evolutionary based diet and fitness, and he came up with that concept. So I got to give him credit for that. But I just latched onto it because I really love it. The physiologic headroom is basically just the delta or the difference between what you're capable of doing or what your output is at complete rest versus the absolute most output that you can generate through exertion. So it's basically the gap between the most you can do and the least you can do. And that kind of overall, I believe, defines your health, especially as it is linked to movement, because as animals, we have to understand that our most basic biologic function is movement. It's how we acquire energy, it's how we get food, and without movement, we can't get food, we can't keep from becoming food. So that definition of physiologic headroom is the grossest and most basic currency of our health and functional ability. In industrialized societies, what you're seeing in terms of physiologic headroom is it's fairly high in youth, but now earlier and earlier in youth and young adulthood, that starts to trend downward. And you have this gradual downward trend of physiologic headroom, where by midlife, your function's severely compromised. A lot of people that are, I'm 58, that are my age, can't get up off the floor. You know, they can't get on the floor to play with their grandchildren, things of that nature. They have a hard time getting up out of a chair without really straining, moaning, or groaning. So that degradation of physiologic headroom over time is basically defining our health status. And as we delve deeper into that bigger, grosser metric and get more granular, I think what we're finding is as that physiologic headroom declines, the chemical messages that are coming out of muscle naturally decline as well. And these are very largely anti-inflammatory molecules that oppose the inflammasome. So the diseases of modern civilization that are largely driven by a really crappy diet have a feed-forward effect on the lack of physical activity and the lack of anti-inflammatory myokines that are being released by the muscle. And it just kind of goes into a death spiral. Even if it does not shorten the lifespan by very much, what it means is for most adults in Western societies, they may be spending more than half of their life at a very suboptimal level in terms of quality of life. And it's a real tragedy. It does shorten life, but more importantly, it shortens the health span. I would rather have 70, 75 good years at my current level of functioning than 100 years where I spend half of it, not able to function well at all. And if that were the trade-off, I would take it. But it turns out that the two go hand in hand. Health span and lifespan will track each other.
Clear. In your experience, practical experience during these years, having implemented a training regime you advocate, and you follow long-term client. I'm talking about long-term client.
Yeah, so that is the most, when I first opened my training facility, that's a personal training facility, Ultimate Exercise in 1997, I was all oriented towards, bodybuilding, athletics, getting people in, seeing how far I could take them. Yeah. And because of the privacy, because of the degree of safety involved, that starts to select out for an older clientele. And that turned out to be my most pleasant surprise, because they were the ones that were having the most impressive, tangible turnarounds. And in a very short period of time, in a period of 6 to 12 weeks, you would have people whose lives were completely turned around. You could have people coming in on walkers or four-prong canes that within weeks had completely discarded any need for that whatsoever. I had older patients that would come back from a trip and say, for the first time in 25 years, I put my own luggage in the overhead bin. I got my own luggage off the luggage carousel. I went to the grocery store, picked up a 50-pound bag of dog food, put it in the back of my car, and went, did I really just do that? And over time, these clients have stuck with me.
Mm-hmm.
And the neat thing is I have clients in different occupations. I have a client that owns his own farm and does independent farming. And he said, you know, at the time I came here, I was on the verge of retirement and having to pass the farm on to my children. And he goes, within a few weeks, he said, that's not necessary. And he's still running and working his farm, you know, 10, 15 years down the line. I have a gentleman that right now we're doing some home remodeling. And, you know, that's pretty, you know, hard labor involved with that. And he's told me, he says, you've extended my career. And as we go on with the demographics of our society, I think that's one of my most significant contributions, because the demographics of society is changing, where this is not a post-World War II baby boom generation where there are tons and tons of young people and tons of young people working into the workforce. So you have more working people than you do retiring people. It's exactly the opposite now. We are in what's called stage 4 or 5 demographics, where unless older people continue to function at a high level and continue to contribute to the economy, the whole thing's going to collapse. And if the health status of westernized society stays as poor as it is, the healthcare systems are going to collapse and take the economy down with it. And the most important thing that drives human evolution, it turns out, and what drove the development of our big brains, is not just sexual selection, but the ability of our species to have intergenerational knowledge and wealth transfers. And that's really, the boomer generation needs to wrap their head around. It ain't all about us. Our job is to pass this on to the younger generations, to pass knowledge and wealth downstream to people that are coming up. And in some weird indirect way, doing this kind of exercise has really contributed to that.
Cool. That's very great. This is also applicable worldwide. I mean, in the Western world.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm Italian. I stay in Italy. I traveled worldwide, and I see the trend is the same everywhere. So, okay, that's good. Let's go a little bit more into some questions after my reading of the Q&A book of Body by Science Q&A book. So, for what concern, those are also questions that I've been asked, and some by most of people. For what concern VO2 max, okay, which is the gold standard for cardio fitness. Now you can better define VO2 max as it is, and is impacted by mitochondrial adaptations, and most of the time, we don't want to go into the cardio, no cardio, and aerobic, but is there. But I would like to understand the strength training, in particular, high intensity strength training, and mitochondrial adaptation and VO2 max. How are they linked together?
Okay, so I'm going to try to make this less complicated than the long explanation.
Yeah. Thank you.
So first thing we have to recognize is that when we are talking about VO2 max, or oxygen uptake, we are basically measuring different forms of exercise against a measuring tool that is relatively primitive. So basically it's measuring the amount of oxygen that you're able to utilize when you're performing exertion. That oxygen utilization occurs inside the mitochondria. So if we're looking at the screen that I'm on right now, if the entire square of the screen that we're looking at is the cell, everything that I'm sitting in, imagine that I'm floating in a liquid cytoplasm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And within the cytoplasm is an ancient bacteria that got incorporated into the cell as a symbiotic organism because it ate the waste products of this cell. And in the process of eating those waste products, it generated a lot of energy. So the cell said, hey, why don't you just come inside here and live? I'll give you my waste products. You turn it into extra energy. I will protect you from the outside environment in exchange for all that extra energy that you generate as your own waste product. So we're each using each other's waste product as each other's fuel, which is really cool. So what happens is out here in the cytoplasm, the cell's basic metabolic process is something called glycolysis. So we take in glucose, we shuttle it through about 18 or 20 steps. And in the process of doing these chemical reactions, we generate off some ATP or energy. The end product or the waste product of that process is pyruvate. Pyruvate is eaten by the mitochondria. It gets shuttled through the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain, which is a complex series of chemical reactions that generate a lot more ATP. How well this does that is a measure of how much oxygen you can utilize, because this is an oxygen-dependent process, whereas this out here is an oxygen-independent process. So it turns out that how much this gets ramped up depends on how quickly you deliver pyruvate to the mitochondria. So whenever you do any sort of exercise or steady state activity, you're just increasing the delivery rate of pyruvate into the mitochondria, making it ramp faster. And that's how VO2 max adapts, because if you make more pyruvate, the mitochondria will go, ooh, let's make more of us.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the ways to make certain that you maximally stimulate VO2 max is out here, this glycolysis can cycle faster than the mitochondria can take it up. So you can generate pyruvate faster than the mitochondria can take it up. So in high intensity exercise, like high intensity strength training, you deliver pyruvate as rapidly as possible and you max out mitochondria's abilities. So that is a way of maxing out VO2 max at the microscopic or mitochondrial level. So that's why when you see these interval training protocols, like a Tabata protocol or 30-second sprint with 1 minute rest repeated several times, those produce just as much VO2 max improvement as 45 minutes of jogging. And that's what those studies are about.
Yeah.
And the same thing's true of resistance training. So there's that. The thing that people conflate in their heads, though, is there are different ways of adapting to an exercise stimulus. Mm-hmm. So doing high intensity strength training and improving VO2 max in this mitochondria as much as possible doesn't mean that you can just do HIIT and be geared up and ready to go run a marathon. Mm-hmm. And there's some reasons for that. One of the reasons is that you have different muscle fiber types. And different muscle fiber types have different amounts of mitochondria in them. So your slow and intermediate twitch muscle fiber types have more mitochondria in them.
Yeah.
So your mitochondrial density is higher in those specific muscle fiber types. Whereas the higher order motor units, the fast twitch motor units, rely more on turning glycolysis really quickly and have fewer mitochondria in them. So if you train more along the high power output strength continuum, you're going to have a disproportionate increase in the size and amount of your higher order motor units, which have a lower mitochondrial density. If you train chronically with low intensity, steady state exercise, those higher order motor units are never recruited. Mm-hmm. So your body shuts down those higher order motor units and allows them to atrophy. That's why marathon runners look very skinny, cachectic, and some of them even look like they just walked out of a prison camp. But by eliminating those higher order motor units, they have muscle that is made up of a higher mitochondrial density. If you train like Usain Bolt, then you're going to have preferential growth of these higher order motor units. And by simple volume, you're going to have some mitochondrial dilution. So you're going to be less well suited to run a marathon. In fact, I heard someone in an interview one time ask Usain Bolt's trainer, you know, there was just some speculation about, I wonder what Usain Bolt's mile time is. And the answer he gave is, I don't know. He's never run a mile. So, but no one can say that Usain Bolt is not aerobically fit. Yeah, exactly. Because he is. That's determined by how much you have stressed the capability of the mitochondria. Where you fit on the endurance sprint continuum is going to be a matter of specialization. So I hope that puts it together in a way that
wow,
makes
it's
sense.
Perfect. Well, every time you talk, I have in my mind some pictures and drawings. So I really have. I would like to do a sort of sketch of what you are saying. Yeah. So because it's yeah, I can imagine exactly what is happening. So yes, that's great. That's so. Yeah, this is also, I assume, is also linked to genetics. So the muscle composition, of course, sure. Usain Bolt is gifted in some way, and others in other way. So because correct me if I'm wrong, the number of fibers is genetically predetermined. Is correct, or there are some changes? Because I'm
ish.
Yeah.
So training we are a lot more plastic than we realize, yeah. And there is hyperplasia of muscle fibers. You can increase the numbers. There are genetically predetermined things that are going to make you more predisposed to being a sprinter, but really it's sort of a marriage of genetics and training and specialization. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it just works out with a vengeance. And in an athlete like that, that's an example of that. Yeah. But by the same token, there are all sorts of genetic markers that we thought would determine, you know, who's going to be the best sprint athlete. If you have a specific polymorphism of the ACE gene, which interestingly these days is the receptor on which the SARS-CoV-2 virus binds to get into the cell. If you have a certain genotype of that receptor, you are better suited for sprint activity. The same thing with an actinin 3 gene, which codes for one of the proteins in the sliding filaments of the skeletal muscle. Same thing with interleukin 15 that determines, you know, what your muscle size and muscle strength is going to be. And there ought to be a perfect recipe of having these different polymorphisms that would make the best sprint athlete possible. But when we look at the best sprinters in the world, none of them have this magic combination. A lot of them are lacking the ideal genotype for sprint, but it still turns out that they're a world-class sprinter. So there's just a lot of unseens going on. And we have a lot more plasticity and control over how we want to express our bodies than we realize.
Yeah, clear. Well, thank you. And for what about, now we jump here and there. So talking about your experience, because I receive a lot of questions about sweat. Okay. So is really needed to sweat a lot in order to have an effective and efficient workout, or really this when presenting your protocol of Body by Science or any other super slow. I had a protocol. This is one of the first questions I received. So can you please finally, from your side and from your practical experience in your gym?
Yeah, so I think the reason people think about sweating as being some sort of marker for the effectiveness of a workout is because I think they're kind of conflating cause and effect a little bit. Most people, if they work out, are going to work out in normal temperatures. And skeletal muscle performing hard work generates a lot of heat. So the mitochondria working hard, a lot of what they put off as the byproduct is heat energy. Brown fat has a lot of mitochondria in it that are uncoupled from oxidative phosphorylation. So what that means is rather than making ATP, they just make heat. Also, muscles, as they work, have a lot of internal friction, and that generates a lot of heat. And that heat needs to be dissipated.
Yeah.
And that heat is dissipated in 3 different ways. There's conduction, which means if your body's against a cold surface, heat will transfer from an area of high to low concentration. There's convection, meaning you just radiate heat out into the environment. And lastly, there's evaporative heat loss mechanism. And that's what we particularly evolved that really drove our human evolution. We don't have fur, and we are able to sweat. So we are able to dissipate the heat of exertion better than any other animal. That's why we survive by persistence hunting. You can go after an antelope and just jog in a zigzag pattern and overheat it to the point where it just collapses, and then you just walk up and kill the thing. That's largely how we survive. But we rely on that evaporative heat loss mechanism when we work hard. Mm-hmm. But that evaporative heat loss mechanism has limits. When you're just pouring sweat, you're not getting any cooler. Mm-hmm. So eventually you're going to reach exhaustion because you can't dissipate heat effectively enough. And when you're doing really, really hard work, by the time you're sweating, it's already too late because you're accumulating heat at a rate at which you can no longer dissipate it effectively. So this was discovered kind of accidentally during the osteoporosis research project way back in the 1980s. So what happened is in the training environment, I don't know if you've ever experienced when when an air conditioning unit is starting to break down and it develops a freon leak and the coils get frozen, what you'll have is a situation where it overcools right before it dies. Well, this was going on in the building where they were conducting the research. So for several days, the room got overly chilled. It got down into the low 60s. And what they discovered just accidentally was that all of the training subjects' performance went through the roof. They went much further before they reached muscular failure. And what they began to realize is that the effective dissipation of heat allows the exertion process to go on for longer and the depth of inroad and fatigue to be greater. So what happened is the incorporation of a cool environment so that you never had to tap into an evaporative heat loss mechanism was permissive for a higher level of exertion. And that's why we use these cooler temperatures in our training environments. Sweating is a marker for hard work at normal temperatures. But if you're going to do really, really hard work, if you can avoid sweating, you can work harder for longer and impose a better training stimulus than if you had sweat. So it just serendipitously turned out to be both something that enhances your training, but also is a great little marketing tool because you can come in, you can get the best workout of your life, and you don't have to take the time to shower, change clothes, get sweaty and stinky and all that sort of stuff. So it turned out just by complete fluke of serendipity to be a discovery about how we could make our training better.
That's cool. That's cool. It's like we have a certain fixed amount of energy, and when we dissipate energy in sweating on so in other ancillary activities, we remove from the same pot energy that we can use to improve our markers and our yes.
Correct. And sweating's an interesting thing. I remember hearing about the cyclist Miguel Indurain, who was like one of the best climbers in the history of cycling. And they talked about when they were testing his VO2 max, he would sweat more than any other athlete they've ever seen in history. So that when they would do a VO2 max test on them, they would literally have to mop the floor around the ergometer when they were done. And a lot of what makes sweating cause the system to break down is a lot of electrolytes are released in sweating.
Yep.
And those electrolytes are necessary for muscle contraction and relaxation. And as those get lost, your ability to perform at a high level degrades very quickly. But what they discovered with Miguel Indurain is they decided to actually test his sweat. And what they found is that it was completely devoid of electrolytes. He sweat essentially completely free water and had no electrolyte depletion in the process, which they believe his ability to heat dissipate without loss of electrolytes is one of the things that made him such a great climber. So there's just all sorts of little unknown variables out there that affect performance.
Unfair advantage, but I think this is
yes,
something.
It is. Well, that's what sports is all about.
Yeah, is the first time I hear. But coming back to sweating, so it's really necessary and needed to drink very frequently during a workout, a normal workout. I mean, I'm not talking about the 2, 3, 4 hours ultra marathon or something like that.
You're talking about during one of our workouts?
Yes.
No, the only reason a lot of times we'll take a water break training our clients, but the main reason for that is the high level of exertion generates really rapid breathing because the lactic acidosis that you generate has to be compensated for by blowing off carbon dioxide. And people get a really dry, cottony mouth. And sometimes just a little water break to kind of moisten your mucous membranes, and also just to have enough of a break to kind of get your wits back to continue and finish the rest of the workout is beneficial. But from a physiologic hydration standpoint, by the time anything you drank would be into the central circulation to have an effect, the workout's over. So
Clear. This is what I was thinking. But coming back to, since we were talking a little bit about lactic acidosis. So when pyruvate accumulate, it's converted into lactic acid. The lactic acid after the intense workout is reutilized. How is it recycled? Because you mentioned more than one time.
Yeah, so let's go back. I'm going to pick up my mouse again, my mitochondrial mouse, and we're going to go back to our cell again. What happens is if you deliver pyruvate to the mitochondria faster than it can take up, the pyruvate stacks up out here in the cytoplasm because it can't get into the mitochondria. When that happens, pyruvate is acted upon by an enzyme in the cytoplasm called lactate dehydrogenase, LDH, converts pyruvate into lactic acid. And that lactic acid starts to accumulate, and it is an acid, and it trades off hydrogen ions. So you'll have a higher content of hydrogen ions in the bloodstream, which is going to drop the pH of the blood. But the lactic acid, when you stop exertion, that's all stacked up out here, can get acted on in the opposite direction, converted back to pyruvate, and cycled back through the mitochondria, just as if it was being pushed through at a rate that the mitochondria could handle it. So in that way, in the half hour or so after a high intensity workout, all that stacked up lactate can get converted back to pyruvate and then shuttled through the mitochondria And it's almost as if you're getting a steady state benefit after the conclusion of your workout. The other thing is everyone thinks of lactic acid because acutely it does degrade performance somewhat.
Yeah.
So they think of it as a negative performance degrading thing that we need to avoid. But actually the reason we make lactate is because our body uses lactate as fuel. So our brain can use lactate to function in the absence of glucose. Lactate can be taken back, can get out into the central circulation, so it can diffuse across the cell membrane of the cell, get out into the central circulation. That's carried by the venous circulation back to the portal vein of the liver. And in the liver, lactate can be pushed back up the glycolysis pathway. So glycolysis running backwards, it's called gluconeogenesis, and you can convert lactate back to glucose and then recycle it back down the pathway. So a well-trained athlete, and this chemical process where it goes back to the liver and is converted back to glucose is called the Cori cycle, C-O-R-I. Well-trained athlete can actually get a second wind out of their lactic acid, or like a little nitro boost, because they can recycle it and keep going. So there'll be a period of fatigue and then a kick in of a second wind kind of experience as they recycle this back to glucose and run it through the pathway again.
Clear, perfect. Thank you. I remember I think it was the 21 convention, you draw the cytoplasm. It's a very nice video. I will post
of all the videos that ever went out, that one has had the most views of anything I ever did. And I had a very well-prepared, I really agonized over what I was going to say to these young men and made a very elaborate presentation. And at the last minute, I mean, right before they called me up there, I just had a feeling about the audience that I was in front of, and I just scrapped the whole thing. And that whole talk that's in the 21 convention thing, I just completely pulled out of my ass. And just did it right there on the grease board, because I thought, what these young men need to understand is that certain things just can't be reduced into a soundbite. So what I thought is, I'm going to take these poor suckers and I'm going to drag them through a semester of med school biochemistry and make them realize that if you take the time to skip the soundbite and go through the complexity, once you've gone through the complexity, the simplicity of it starts to strike you. And that's what led to that.
I think this is the basics. And then I remember talking about fructose. I remember you drew a line straight. So because fructose goes straight into bypassing a lot of steps before reducing.
I can explain that kind of briefly. So fructose is just one of the steps in the degradation of glucose as it drives through glycolysis. So you got glucose, and you got glucose 6-phosphate, and then the next metabolic step is glucose 1,6-diphosphate, and then the next step is fructose 1,6-diphosphate, fructose 6-phosphate. So there's a level of glycolysis where it's changed into fructose. Well, at that level of glycolysis, that junction of glycolysis is a point in a feedback cycle. So imagine this fructose level in glycolysis as being the temperature sensor in your thermostat. So as you proceed, if you have a high energy state and you move glucose all the way through the glycolysis cycle, and you move it all the way through the mitochondria, as you get about 2/3 of the way through the mitochondria, you generate a chemical called citrate. Citrate is like the temperature in your house. Like if you're cooling your house to 70 degrees, when the ambient temperature gets to be 70 degrees, that feeds back to the thermostat and turns off the air conditioner. So when you're in a very high energy state, you're pushing energy through the mitochondria, and that generates enough citrate that feeds back at the level of fructose and shuts off glycolysis. So when you're in a high energy state, if you intake any carbohydrate, especially if you intake fructose, as in high fructose corn syrup, it's blocked from going down glycolysis because the thermostat has turned off the air conditioning. So the only thing that can happen at that level is it gets shuttled across through a process called de novo lipogenesis, where you turn fructose into triacylglycerol or triglycerides, which are mobilized for fat storage. So when your energy state is chronically high, citrate feeds back to fructose, blocks glycolysis, and shunts everything towards fat. And that's where a lot of people in Western society, through the Western diet, are chronically stuck. Everything they eat gets shuttled into fat storage. And because so much of the kind of fat that they eat is a type of fat that doesn't allow fat to be moved out of storage, they end up overstuffing their fat cells. So they have energy trapping or internal starvation. They can eat, but that intake energy never gets able to be used for energy utilization. It all just gets shunted towards storage. So that's why people are constantly hungry and constantly refeeding. And the industrial food companies know this. When they say you can't eat just one, they mean it, because they have engineered the food to be that way.
Clear. That's very true. That is true. One of the last questions, because we are going toward the end of our conversation. In terms of warming up, or actually, we are talking about the standard Big Five, or one of your typical workout in your facility. Do I need to warm up to do some dynamic something before starting the exercise, or I go straight into that?
In general, no.
Yeah.
So with a relatively slow, it doesn't have to be 10-10, but a cadence-controlled strength training regimen builds the warm-up into the initial repetitions, because relative to your capability, you are holding back somewhat. So your first 2 repetitions may represent anywhere between 25 and 50% output. And as you accumulate fatigue, the difference between your output and the resistance you've chosen starts to close, and then it becomes hard. So literally at the conclusion of the set, you're becoming too weak to hurt yourself. So the warm-up is built into it. I would qualify that by saying that sometimes people need a little bit of a warm-up, not for physiologic reasons, but for psychological reasons, just to kind of, get ready for it mentally. In that case, that's fine. The other case in which a warm-up might be necessary is if you have a deranged arthritic or injured joint. So sometimes people have, bad knees, and doing a light warm-up sort of gets movement going, and the synovium, which is the lining of the joint that produces the lubricating fluid, sometimes the warm-up will generate a little bit of that lubricating fluid before you go to the higher load. So if someone has an injured joint or a chronically inflamed or deranged joint, sometimes those people benefit from a brief warm-up before they launch into the full high-intensity workout.
Yeah, but as you mentioned, we can do this warm-up basically mimicking the same, leg press. We do the first reps at 25%, something like that, just to have the blood flowing and this lubrication ongoing. Then we can start.
Yeah, well, no. So what I'm saying is not to select a weight that's 25% of what you're going to use in your set. What I'm saying is when you pick a weight, the weight is a constant amount. And then you're just lifting and lowering and lifting and lowering across that constant amount. But towards the end of the set, the amount of force you're able to produce is coming down to what the weight is and then dropping below what the weight is. And that's what failure is. So when you select your training weight for leg press, what I'm saying is those first 2 or 3 repetitions, actually, because your capability's up here, as you go across the set. So what happens is your capability degrades down to the level of the weight. but during the first few repetitions, that first repetition probably represents less than 50% of what you're actually capable of. So those first few repetitions in a standard high intensity set represent a warm up, so that you are fully warm by the time that you get to the really high exertion portion of the set. And you're now literally too weak to hurt yourself. You can't generate enough force to exceed the structural capabilities of your body.
Ah, very cool, very cool. I remember, I think in the 21 convention, you and also Drew Bay, it was a nice way of seeing this with the graphical representation.
Zigzag.
Yeah, exactly. This is another tool that we can show to the public. So we are quite at the end. So you mentioned that the beginning that okay, in Germany your book is very popular. I'm not sure in Italy, because I don't know. First of all, are you planning a new work, something to issue, and anything new in this year or in the next one?
In terms of book writing, you mean?
Yeah.
No, probably not in that time frame at all. Mostly just because it's such a slow moving process. But no. And with regard to your question, I've approached McGraw-Hill multiple times about translating into Italian, but it's weird. I didn't understand so much about book publishing that I've learned over the years. Translation into other languages doesn't happen from the publisher's standpoint. What happens is someone in the country in question approaches McGraw-Hill and asks for the rights to publish it in their language. So Body by Science has been translated, I believe, into German, and that was done via Werner Kieser. It's been translated into Korean.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? I have no idea. So someone that's a publisher in another country approaches McGraw-Hill and asks for the right. It never works where I can just go to the publisher and say, hey, why don't you put this out in Italian? And they're like, no, we don't work that way. Someone has to ask us for the rights, and then we make royalties off their work. So it's a weird process. So if you can find some rich benefactor in Italy that wants to do it, then that probably is the way it would go.
Sure. This is my intention. We'll see. Best way to connect?
Probably through the website, which is drmcguff.com or drmcguff.com. That's just sort of a general landing spot. There's a blog that I haven't added to in some time. There's a link to the YouTube channel. On YouTube, it's just Dr.Doug McGuff channel. But there's links to there, and also the phone consultation process that I do has a scheduling software on there for anyone that wants to do phone consultation. That's available there as well. Podcasts as well. I schedule podcasts through the consultation software, that kind of thing.
I follow you on different on YouTube. You produce some really nice short videos every now and then. So one of the latest is about the pro-resolving mediators. I really invite everyone to have a look. So are you on the same? I think it's quite recent about the pro-resolving mediators. So
and I'm happy to report that actually that's getting some traction now.
Okay.
There's a critical care specialist at Harvard named Bruce Levy that is starting to launch a trial looking at a subsegment of pro-resolving mediators and using them in cytokine storm as it relates to COVID-19. So I really think, and there's a new video that will come up soon, I'll put up in the next few days. I really do think there's been a lot of focus on what's so unique about the SARS-CoV-2 virus and how it's, how it's expressing itself in this pandemic. But I think one thing that has not really been looked at as well as it should be is what are the unique nature of the human population which is being infected that's driving how this pandemic is expressing itself. And I think peculiarities of the Western diet, the heavy loading of omega-6 relative to omega-3 fatty acids, and in particular, how much linoleic acid is in our diet and therefore incorporated into our body is a lot of what is likely driving the cytokine storm, and probably explains why obesity seems to be a major risk factor, because most people in westernized societies have become obese not simply by overconsumption of energy relative to output, but by signal disruptions by these very novel industrial seed oils that are incorporated into our bodies and really drive inflammation. I think there's a lot to be learned about us as an organism rather than the virus.
Yeah, clear. Yeah, about the diet, I will mention after this your quote. I think the perfect diet is just to keep straight the way from the sun to the plate, something like that. So I will quote the exact. Yes. So with this, I really thank you for your time, and I think this is a very fruitful conversation. We will be in touch by email or chat in the next weeks. So
awesome.
Thank you very much again.
All right.
Nice day.
It was very nice talking to you.
Bye.
Ehi tu, sì, proprio tu, sto parlando con te. Tu che hai visto questo video, hai cliccato qui, hai cliccato lì, su, giù, su, in giro, hai girato, hai cliccato dove devi cliccare, ti sei subscribed, hai condiviso. Se l'hai fatto, bene. Ma se non lo avessi fatto,